Here is Taccia Ukiyo Sharaku-kurocha, a brown ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
While I'm sure I butchered that name, the writing samples are kind of a milk chocolate feeling. Surprising that I like it, as generally the chocolate type brown inks I don't really care for. This is ridiculously consistent in performance, as tone is unchanged by pen or paper, and the shading is consistent and ever present. So on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it looks the same as it does on the premium, making it a great purchase for people who use the cheaper paper more frequently than they do the premium stuff. Such a beautiful brown with a name I can't pronounce, but regardless, I want a bottle of this beautiful brown ink. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is a TWSBI Mini.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a beautiful mid-tone brown with no feathering, no spread, some nice shading that's going on. Really, it's not like it's camouflage, but they definitely did a great job. Let's just point out one with pointed out on the first line, where the PO is quite a bit darker than the IN. The TE get very dark, and that D lightens up a little bit. The out starts lighter at the O, works its way gradually to very dark at the T. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did with the extra fine. Luckily, I enjoy shading. Take a look at Luckily on the second line, where the luck part of it is largely the same tone. The end of the K into the I does get a little bit darker. It lightens some on the L, gets much darker again with the Y at the N. Saved. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the extra fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade. I think it's doing a great job. Look at Think on the second line, where the T is quite a bit lighter than the H, which is very dark in the middle of this word. It lightens up on the IN. It's during that K that it does darken a little bit. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 8 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. I'm inclined to really enjoy this ink. Looking at Inclined on the second line, where the I is darker than the Incline, which lighten up a little bit. That ED at the end does get a bit darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade thoroughly throughout the writing. Taking a look at Thoroughly on the first line, where the T is lighter than the H, which gets a bit darker. The OUROU GH get lighter, but the LY at the end do darken up a bit. So we tend to get some stretches of lighter letters, but those really dark letters come through very nicely and really add a nice accent. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade without any problem, bringing some very nice accents into the writing. Look at Bringing on the third line, where the bringy at the beginning is a nice mid-tone. The NG at the end darken up a bit. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade. It doesn't show as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it is definitely there. Nothing to get angry about. Look at angrily on the third line, where the AN is lighter in tone than the GR, which darken up some. The ILY at the end does get even darker still. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, showing the treasure that this ink truly is. Seeing treasure on the first line, where the T is lighter than the R, which is quite dark. It lightens up into the EA, but the S to U darkens just a little bit. The R lightens up a little bit, and that E at the end, darker again. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, strangely, but I don't think it is bad. Take a look at Think on the second line, where the T is light, the H is dark, the N lighten up a bit, but that K at the end, dark again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes back here. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade. Not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it does shade without any kind of a problem. Most importantly, we're looking at this quad rule paper, and on the quad rule, it definitely stands out and is easily readable, making it a winner here. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It is easily standing out from that quad rule, letting that melt away into the background and not being distracting at all. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, it does, I just got distracted, it does stand out from the quad rule without any kind of a problem, so fantastic. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Pilot Yamaguri or Wild Chestnut. Here is Rohrenklinger Sepia. Here is Sailor Hagugate Gegon. Here is Visconti Sepia. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, not quite as well as it does on the Clairfontaine, but it is doing a great job. It stands out against this quad rule with no problem, making this a great ink for a student that wants something other than the regular blue, black that often gets used, not blue, black, but blue or black that often just gets used in school. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, it stands out against the quad rule. It does an amazing job here. 10 bonus points to the student that uses this in their notebook. Now, as a note, there will be no stub because I forgot and I've already cleaned the pen. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes back here. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Sailor Kobe number 30. Here is Pilot 100th Anniversary Green.
Here is Three Oysters Hang Toe.
Here is Diamine Blue Black.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Did I say this was consistent? I meant consistent. It does have some feathering and it does have some spread. They are incredibly minor. Not a problem for on here, well under control. Absolutely fantastic. Shading, no. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread. Both of those a little bit more than happened with the extra fine. I think we're crossing the barrier here where it's not as good as it was with the extra fine. I wouldn't want to use this with the medium on this paper, though it's also not shading, but it is copy paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, not as bad as it did with the medium, a little bit worse than it did with the extra fine. I think what we're getting here is usable if you really wanted to use it. Is it shading? There's a couple of spots, not a standout feature. Really, the standout feature is it looks good on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that you probably can't continue your notes back here because it does get very deep into the paper, though nothing bled through touching the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
Every pen gives the same tone and they all shade just as well. So this is absolutely a winner of a brown ink and goes in any pen. Because of that, it's a dealer's choice. So ink up and enjoy. Now, I do realize that I missed the stub writing on the lab notebook and that's going to be the biggest problem that everybody has, and so be it. I would encourage you to get this ink, get a stub nib, a lab notebook, and go create the writing sample for yourself. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.